next we have David Vorick, who is going to talk about managing centralization.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so quick introduction. My name is David Vorick. In 2014, I founded a decentralized storage protocol called CES, which is still operational, still actively developed. And in 2017, I founded a ASIC manufacturing company that is still around, but we're not actively doing anything at the moment. So a lot of these opinions come from the background of like being on the ground level and seeing kind of cryptocurrencies unfold in real time, especially the mining industry. So the thrust of the first point is that mining is currently centralized, and the situation is like pretty bad. So the just like walking through the stack. At the top of the stack, pretty much all cryptocurrency mining chips today come out of TSMC and Samsung. And for a long time, it was mostly TSMC. I think for various reasons, Samsung's like kind of come to the forefront for this cycle. I would expect Samsung to go back into the background in the near future. So generally speaking, it's like usually it's just TSMC, but right now they're kind of sharing it. But it's just two, and there's no one else. Then at the next level down, so TSMC and Samsung, they make the chips, but you have to go from a chip to a board to a rig, with fans and stuff. And so there are only really like 5 major companies that manufacture rigs, which would be Bitmain, WhatsMiner, Canaan, Bitfury, and NanoSilicon. And generally speaking, mining manufacturing is a little bit more of a winner takes all. Mining rigs don't have like multiple features to compete across. Either it's like does a ton of hash rate at not much electricity consumption, or it's just a worse product. So usually each cycle you have one miner that's pretty dominant, and usually that's Bitmain. Bitmain's like key development team left and turned into WhatsMiner. So WhatsMiner is like a challenger right now, but it's really just the same people that it's always been, which is kind of demoralizing. Mining pools are also centralized, so we come as we get down the stack, things get a little bit better. So there are 8 mining pools that have 80% of the hash rate. Current protocols, the mining pools decide what blocks they mine, which means they have control over the protocol and what gets mined. But there's a lot of research being done and a lot of deployment being done to try and fix this. And mining pools are also a lot like more flexible. It's difficult to if you decide you don't like Bitmain, it's difficult to push them out because you can't just poof a mining rig out of nowhere. Mining pools, on the other hand, is a lot of software. A lot of the software is not that difficult to write, and a lot of it is, but you can switch mining pools a lot easier than you can switch manufacturers. And then kind of at the bottom, you have the mining farms, which is definitely the most decentralized thing. My understanding, mining farms generally don't publish clean data, so it's hard to know how many mining farms there are and where they're located. But we know that roughly 60% of the Bitcoin hash rate is in China. It's probably, a low dozens, 10 to 20 mining farms to get to 50, 60% of the hash rate. Although, I'm not super confident about this data because it's not available. And this is definitely the best situation. Turns out that cheap electricity isn't that scalable. And at least for now, that's working in our benefit. But it's still ultimately not the one CPU, one vote vision that was originally presented. And then finally, progress to decentralized mining has been slow. If you look at decentralizing TSMC, that just feels like an insurmountable task. Decentralizing Bitmain is something that has been tried a bunch of times, generally failed at great cost to the people who tried it. And then the mining pool situation again is not so bad. Things are moving slowly, but it does look like we might get to a point where mining pools are actually reasonably decentralized. Okay, so the second point is that this is kind of inherent to the way mining economics are set up. So the key thing that kills everything is that Bitcoin mining is zero sum. So if Bitmain comes out with a rig that's faster and more energy efficient than everyone else's rigs, this hurts everyone else's profitability. So if you are a miner and then someone else comes online with something better than what you have, your revenue drops, your profitability drops, and that means that you're kind of in a survival mode. Mining is ongoing an incredibly expensive thing, and so generally, if you are not running competitive hardware or in a competitive data center, you get pushed out. And so one thing that we saw on, when we were manufacturing is if your competitors are lying, if your competitors are raising money, using dubious means, if there's like legal stuff that's happening that doesn't make any sense, that's profit margin for them that you don't have. If you like refuse to compete using like dirty tactics, you just won't be able to survive, at least in our experience. And, so take it with a grain of salt. But basically, every dollar that your competitor can get that you're excluding yourself from ethical means is you getting put out of business. And every dollar that you spend on true decentralization, or like we really wanted to open source a ton of stuff, and just our engineers, we needed all of their time focused on building and optimizing. We couldn't take someone aside for 2 or 3 weeks and give them 3 weeks to like present it to the public. And so it was a lot more challenging than the like survival grind was very strong. And so I just think that indicates to me that mining is inherently like a centralized process, and the economies of scale cut a lot deeper than just normal economies of scale. It's like this zero-sum survival grind that really blinds you to being able to do anything else. So I wanted to present today the challenge of like, what if as protocol designers, we get rid of the assumption that you have 51% of the hash rate that is not colluding. And it says honest up here, but really what I mean is like not colluding to be strategic. And so I think it would be interesting to kind of open the doors to this new assumption where we just assume that a blockchain is always going to end up with a single monopoly miner on top of it, and then see what happens to our ecosystem if we have to live under that assumption. And I would say that just having been on the ground, I think that assuming that 50% of the hash rate is not colluding is always going to be like risky and tenuous. And I think we should consider just accepting that we might end up with monopoly miners, and then design around that. So there are really like 2 things that we want to do if we have a monopoly miner. The first is that we want to limit what powers they have. So depending on how you design the protocol, blockchain miners can be malicious in different ways. And so we want to minimize the window of opportunity for a monopoly miner to be malicious. And then the second thing is that we would like to have kind of a penalty. So if we catch them being malicious, we have some way to cause damage, or just generally disincentivize them from acting maliciously. So I would highlight 2 like fundamental miner powers that I don't think you can get around in any blockchain. The first one is that the miners, they choose the transaction ordering, they choose how blocks form. So if you have a monopoly miner, your monopoly miner is just fundamentally going to be able to censor transactions from making it into consensus. And then the second thing is because they build chains, they can reorganize the chains or reorder history at a cost. They have to redo work. And so there's some price that a miner has to pay to reorganize history, but I don't think in a standard blockchain that you really have a good decentralized way to stop reorgs. And then in a lot of protocols, we get these bonus powers. So for example, SPV nodes assume that miners are mining valid blocks. If you have a monopoly miner, this assumption maybe becomes like a lot more questionable. In some protocols, miners can do things like set the block fees or set the block size. And so if you have a monopoly miner, they might play with this parameter. And then some protocols go even a step further and just give like the miners unilateral power to change consensus rules, which definitely, if you have a monopoly miner, is not something you should do. So basically if we're going to assume a monopoly miner, you want to cut out as many of these things as we can. So I think we would want to stop with SPV, definitely stop giving them the ability to change consensus rules, and even things like soft fork activation we saw during the whole SegWit thing. You don't want miners to have power. They have a job to like build blocks. If you let them choose to activate or not activate a soft fork, that's giving power to the miners. And if we're assuming monopoly miners, maybe that's something we don't want to do. So to address censorship potential, one thing that you can do is if you can make every transaction indistinguishable from every other transaction and just everything's identical, it becomes essentially impossible for a miner to selectively censor transactions. Either they have to choose to block everything that like kills the chain, or they have to choose to accept everything. And so I think this is one of the ways that a miner can fundamentally choose to censor, but if we can hide from them what transaction is what, this power is not going to do a malicious miner any good. And so that's like one step we can take to protect ourselves from a monopoly miner. Then the second thing is that we can limit double spend potential or history reorg potential by asking for more confirmations. If it's a valuable transaction, ask for a lot more confirmations. And then also, I think this bears a little further investigation than I hand wave here that you should just use layer 2 as much as possible, depend on channels that are super buried. The hand wave is probably like too optimistic, and we should probably dive into that deeper. And then maybe there's future research. I think this is an open question. What are design principles that we can use or techniques that we can use to limit the malice that a miner can do if we assume that we have a monopoly miner mining our chain? Okay, that brings me to the final section, which is penalizing rogue miners. Censorship and reorgs are both detectable if you're watching in real time. So if you have a node that's sitting on the network, you see a transaction, it has a high enough fee to make it into a block, it's not making it into a block, you can determine that censorship is happening there. And again, this does require you to be watching in real time, so you can't go to your friend who is offline and prove to them that malice was happening. But in real time, we can see censorship, and in real time, we can see when large blockchain reorgs happen. So if the protocol is running honestly, there's a probability of a reorg of a certain depth, and if we see a reorg on chain that goes beyond the probable depth, we can assume an attack because it's just probabilistically likely. So what I'm proposing is if we detect an attack, we have some means of penalizing the miner, and these penalties have to be off-chain. So the miner controls what transactions make it onto the blockchain. Therefore, the miner can make sure that anything that penalizes the miner doesn't make it on chain. And so if you're doing like fraud proofs or somehow trying to provide evidence that the miner was malicious, the miner can just like deny access and never be penalized. So we have to find some out-of-band way to penalize the miner. And so the next few slides give like some ideas. Okay, so as a prereq, mining is expensive. This is intentional. It requires a lot of specialized hardware. This is also intentional. It gives you a lot of revenue. And so essentially, the out-of-band techniques that we can use, we want to find some way to threaten that revenue by off-chain behaviors that we can have. So one example of like a really heavy-handed thing is if a miner attacks a chain, you can just quit altogether. So you leave the chain, you leave the ecosystem, you sell everything, and you walk. If there's a lot of money at stake for the miner, this is actually like something the miner is going to be afraid of, and it's an effective deterrent. But then it's also like something you have to follow through on, and so it's a big bet to pursue this strategy because we're essentially like putting the entire industry on the line. But I think that if we can't find a way to get consensus stable in a reliable way, then it is worth walking away altogether. So I don't think this is an empty threat. This is something we should take seriously as like a community, but it's also not our only option. So something that's like less severe would be to change the hashing algorithm. So if you switch from like SHA-256 to SHA-256 prime, you need some extra circuit that only one miner has. You can break whoever the bad actor is, or you can just switch away to a new algorithm entirely. You can change supply chains. This really damages the miners, and this has been done in practice. Normally, ASIC-resistant coins breaking ASIC coins. Saya did something like this about a year ago now, and from our perspective, it was super effective. Miners were very respectful after they lost like close to $100 million. So I do feel that like on the ground floor, since our hard fork, miners have been more respectful of developers, especially altcoin developers, and like cautious, like, oh, are you going to break our stuff if we do something? Which is really the point. You want miners to pay attention to you and take care of you. So this is one that I think Also, like at the Bitcoin level, this requires a ton of coordination. It's going to inevitably split the chain. It's like really heavy-handed. Ideally, we have other things we can do. I skipped strategy 3. I think I deleted that slide. Apologies. But strategy 4 is to do a counterattack. So if you have something like more general purpose hardware, a chain gets attacked, you can rent a ton of hash power off a nice hash. You can counterattack. The attacker is going to lose money making blocks. You're going to spend money mining a chain, but that should turn into revenue, at least over short-range attacks. Over long-range attacks, it gets a lot more complicated. But I would say that I would conjecture that there are counterattack games that you can set up which are interesting and are not as expensive to the defender as they are to the attacker. So they're asymmetric in the event that the defender wins. And if the defender loses, it's asymmetric the other way, which may or may not be useful. And then you can kind of combine some of these strategies. So if you say, if we ever see a successful attack, we leave altogether and the whole ecosystem collapses, you kind of have an incentive for everyone who wants the ecosystem to be sustained to participate in a counterattack. And so the person who is the victim of the censorship or the double spend may not be the only one fighting to have the counterattack succeed. So they're like, we get into a lot more involved games and really beyond the scope of this talk. And so I can say I have more ideas. They didn't really fit easily into this presentation, but I do think that this is a pretty underlooked at area, and I think it's something that merits more attention. I'm not saying that we should like tomorrow just drop that assumption and like change everything that we do in Bitcoin starting tomorrow, but I do think that we're getting to the point where we should start taking this assumption more seriously and start looking at things that we should be doing to protect ourselves if it turns out that monopoly miners are the steady state. And I don't think that. No, I'm already in conclusion. And I don't think that the results are all that pessimistic. I think if we do decide to accept this as a real assumption of a blockchain, we are able to design blockchains that will be functional and useful and have practical applications on top of them. And I don't think it's disastrous to adopt this assumption. We just have to be a lot more strict about certain aspects of the protocol design. All right, and questions I think are.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, David. Why don't we do one question again while we're transitioning, and then of course there'll be more time during the discussion. So yeah. Okay.
Same laptop.
What do you pick?
Because he was using mine.
All right, in the back.
I'm just gonna give you some time warnings, 5 minute, 2 minute, 1 minute.
Sounds good. Thanks.
In the transaction pool, the time at which a transaction was proposed, because if it is, one would think that you could design a system where there's an incentive for miners to put transactions on a block as soon as possible, and conversely a penalty for leaving transactions off.
Yes, I think, so this is something that was explored, I want to say in like 2013 or 2014. It causes complicated interactions with reorgs. So if a transaction fee loses value over time, you have now incentives, like big incentives, to go and reorder history and pretend like you got that transaction into an earlier block. You get into like these fee sniping games. So I don't remember how rigorous the conclusion was, but I think the general feeling this is just an IRC discussion, but I think the general feeling from that IRC discussion was that it's probably more problems created than solved. Okay.